A rusted train car hidden deep in the Montana mountains held something that made a homeless veteran stop breathing the moment he saw it. The steel floor exploded upward with a metallic crack as Duke barked furiously beside the opening. Snow whipped through the broken doorway, stinging Frank's face. His flashlight beam dropped into the darkness below, revealing a hidden compartment no one should have known existed. Then he spotted a name written across an old journal, and his hands froze. What do you think was hidden inside? The bank manager kept talking long after Frank Sullivan stopped listening. Snow drifted past the window behind the man's desk, soft and silent, covering the streets of Hamilton, Montana in a fresh layer of white. The heater clicked somewhere in the office. Papers shuffled. A pen scratched across a signature line. Frank's eyes stayed on the cardboard box sitting beside his chair. Everything that remained of his life fit inside it. A framed photograph of his wife, Linda. A folded American flag. A flashlight. 3 paperbacks with cracked spines, and an old metal tin he hadn't opened in years. "I'm sorry it came to this, Frank." The manager's voice finally broke through. Frank nodded once. The trailer was gone. The bank had waited as long as it could. Medical bills, property taxes, repairs. One bad year stacked on another until there was nothing left to stack them on. At 73, Frank had learned there were moments when arguing accomplished nothing. So he stood. His knees cracked. The manager offered his hand. Frank shook it. Then he walked out into the cold. The wind hit him immediately. Across the parking lot sat his faded blue pickup truck. Duke was waiting inside. The German shepherd lifted his head the moment he saw Frank. The dog's ears perked, tail thumped once against the seat. Not excited, just checking. "Still here?" Frank opened the door. "I'm still here, buddy." Duke rested his muzzle on Frank's arm. The warmth of the dog cut through the cold, better than the truck's broken heater ever could. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Frank started the engine. The pickup coughed, rattled, finally caught, and they pulled away. No destination, no home, just a road disappearing beneath falling snow. By afternoon, he found himself parked outside the small ranch house that had belonged to Linda's daughter. Melissa stood on the porch, with her arms crossed. The for sale sign leaned beside the driveway. Frank had known about the sale for weeks. Still, seeing it hurt more than he expected. His late wife's family land, gone. The last piece of something that once felt permanent. Melissa stepped down onto the porch stairs. "I didn't know where else to send the papers." Frank accepted the envelope. The legal documents confirmed what he already knew. The property had been sold. Every acre, every fence line, every memory. Melissa looked uncomfortable. Maybe guilty, maybe not. "I had debts, Frank." He nodded. She waited for an argument. None came. After a few seconds, she looked away first. The wind rattled the dead cottonwoods along the fence. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Frank tucked the envelope under his arm. "Take care of yourself." Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it. Frank returned to the truck. Duke watched him climb inside. The shepherd's brown eyes seemed to notice everything, always had. Frank scratched behind the dog's ears. "Just you and me now." Duke leaned against him. That was answer enough. The mountains appeared on the horizon as dusk settled over western Montana. Dark ridges, white peaks, the Bitterroots. Frank drove until the town lights disappeared behind him. When darkness finally swallowed the highway, he pulled into an abandoned turnout, overlooking a frozen valley. The truck engine died. Silence followed. The kind that made a man hear things he'd spent years trying to forget. Metal, clanging, radio chatter, distant explosions. For a split second his chest tightened. A flash of Iraq, dust, smoke, a convoy moving through a narrow road outside Mosul. Frank blinked hard. The memory dissolved. Only snow remained. Duke had already moved closer. The dog pressed against his leg, grounding him, pulling him back. Frank let out a slow breath. "Good catch." Outside, snowflakes drift through the headlights. Inside the truck, the darkness felt smaller. Eventually, he reached for the old metal tin inside the cardboard box. Rust marked the corners. The lid squealed when he opened it. Inside lay a handful of yellowed photographs, railroad tickets, a pocket watch that no longer worked, and beneath everything else, a folded map. Frank frowned. He recognized it instantly. His father's handwriting covered the edges. He unfolded it carefully. An old railroad survey map stretched across his lap. Most of it meant nothing, until he noticed a red circle. One location, one mark, mile 47. Frank stared at it. The route cut through a remote section of the Bitterroot Mountains. Abandoned rail line. No towns nearby. No reason to go there. His father had never spoken about it. Not once. Duke lifted his head. Frank turned the paper over. Something was written on the back. The ink had faded, but it was still readable. His father's handwriting, steady, deliberate. Frank felt the world narrow around those words. If everything else is gone, go here. The truck sat motionless beneath the falling snow. Frank read the sentence again, and then a third time. Outside, the Bitterroot Mountains waited in darkness. Somewhere beyond them, mile 47. Frank barely slept that night. The truck sat beneath a stand of dark pines while snow drifted across the windshield in slow waves. Every hour or so he woke, checked the mirrors, scanned the tree line and listened. Old habits. Some men came home from war and left it behind. Others carried pieces of it for decades. At dawn, the world outside had turned white. Duke was already awake. The German shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat, staring toward the mountains as if he knew exactly where they were headed. Frank folded the map again. Mile 47. It was all he had, which made it enough. The pickup climbed north through roads that grew narrower with every mile. The towns disappeared first, then the ranches, then even the power lines faded into the wilderness. By noon, the road became little more than 2 tire tracks cutting through the snow. Frank drove slowly. The old truck rattled over frozen ruts. Every few minutes he checked the mirrors, then the ridge lines, then the tree line. Not because he expected trouble, because he always did. Duke rested his front paws on the dashboard. His nose twitched constantly, taking in scents carried by the wind. The farther they traveled, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no machinery, no distant highway noise. Only wind moving through endless pine forests. At one point, Frank stopped beside an abandoned service road. Fresh tracks crossed the snow. Not deer, not elk, truck tires, recent, maybe a day old, maybe less. He crouched beside them. The pattern was unfamiliar, heavy tread, wide spacing. Someone had been out here recently. Duke sniffed the tracks, then looked deeper into the forest. His ears lifted. Frank noticed. Something catch your attention? Duke remained perfectly still, watching, listening. A moment later he relaxed. Whatever had been there was gone. Still, Frank filed it away. Observe, remember, move on. The habits of a scout never fully disappeared. By mid-afternoon, the road ended entirely. Ahead lay only snow-covered ground and a narrow corridor carved through the trees. The old rail line. Frank shut off the engine. Silence settled around them. The cold hit immediately. Sharp, dry, mountain cold. The kind that seemed to reach inside your coat and search for bone. Duke jumped down first. Snow crunched beneath his paws. Frank grabbed the map. Mile 47 wasn't far now. Less than a mile on foot. The two of them began walking. The abandoned tracks curved through the forest like a forgotten scar. Rust poked through snow in places. Elsewhere, the rails vanished entirely beneath drifts. The farther they went, the stranger the landscape felt. Trees grew thicker. The mountains pressed closer. Even the air seemed heavier, as though the wilderness itself was watching. An hour later, Frank saw it. At first, he thought it was another cluster of trees. Then the shape emerged through the snowfall. Dark, angular, massive, a train car. His footsteps slowed. The thing sat several yards off the tracks, tilted slightly to one side. Time had nearly swallowed it whole. Rust streaked down the steel sides. One set of wheels had sunk deep into the earth. Small pines grew around it like guards. The train car looked less abandoned than buried, like something the mountain had tried to hide. Duke stopped instantly. Every muscle in his body tightened. His ears shot forward. His tail became rigid. Frank noticed the change. Easy. But Duke wasn't afraid. He was focused. The dog began moving toward the train car with deliberate steps, not cautiously, purposefully, as if he recognized something. The steel walls groaned softly when the wind pushed against them. The sound echoed through the trees, long, low, almost human. Frank approached the nearest side. The faded paint had long ago peeled away. Only fragments remained, numbers, letters, marks worn nearly invisible by weather. Then he saw something else. Near one corner, carved deep into the metal, a symbol, simple. 3 intersecting lines forming a rough triangle. Frank froze, his stomach tightened. He knew that mark. He had seen it before, years ago, inside one of his father's notebooks. A notebook filled with sketches, measurements, and strange symbols that never seemed connected to anything. At the time, Frank had assumed it was railroad shorthand. Nothing important. Now the exact same mark sat before him. Cut into steel, deliberately, permanent. Duke let out a low sound. Not a growl, more like recognition. The dog circled toward the opposite side of the train car. Frank barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the symbol. Snow drifted across the steel surface. The wind moaned through broken seams. Suddenly, the train car didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt waiting, as though someone had expected him to arrive. Frank reached out and touched the cold metal. The surface burned against his fingertips. For a long moment, he simply stood there. One old soldier, one aging dog, one forgotten train car hidden deep inside the Montana wilderness. Then Duke barked sharply. Once, Frank turned. The German shepherd stood near a partially open sliding door. Snow had piled against the entrance, but there was enough space to squeeze through. Duke stared into the darkness beyond, waiting. Frank looked back at the strange symbol one last time, then toward the black opening. The daylight was already fading. Shadows stretched across the snow, and somewhere, high above the mountains, storm clouds were gathering. Whatever answers existed, they were inside. Frank ducked beneath the partially open door and stepped into darkness. The air changed immediately. Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of pine and snow. Inside, everything smelled of rust, dust, and decades of silence. Duke slipped in ahead of him. The German shepherd's nails clicked softly against the steel floor. Frank switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, empty, at least at first glance. The train car stretched nearly 60 feet long. Rust stained the walls. Old wooden crates sat collapsed in corners. Snow had drifted through broken seams near the roof. Nothing looked valuable. Nothing looked remarkable. Yet, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that someone had meant for him to invent this place. The flashlight passed over another carved symbol. Then another, each one identical to the mark outside, his father's mark. Frank lowered himself onto one knee. The grooves were deep, not accidental. Someone had taken time carving them. His father had never spoken about any of this, not once. And now the dead man seemed to be speaking from every wall. Duke continued moving through the train car, methodical, checking corners, pausing to sniff, then moving again. Like a working dog clearing a structure, Frank almost smiled. Some habits never left either of them. The sun disappeared quickly behind the mountains. By late afternoon, the temperature had fallen sharply. Frank made his decision. They would stay the night, maybe longer. He gathered broken pieces of wood from old shipping pallets. Most were damp, some were rotten. Enough remained usable. Near one corner, he assembled a small stove from supplies he carried in the truck. Nothing fancy, just practical. Years in Iraq had taught him that survival often depended on simple things done correctly. A little heat, a little shelter, a little patience. Outside, darkness swallowed the mountains. Inside, a small fire finally caught. Orange light flickered across the steel walls. For the first time all day, warmth touched the air. Duke settled beside the stove. Frank sat with his back against the wall. The flames danced. The train car creaked, and for a few precious minutes everything felt still. Then came the first sound. Clang. Frank's eyes snapped open. His body moved before his mind did. One hand reaching, shoulders tightening, searching for danger. The sound echoed through the train car. Metal against metal, sharp, violent. The firelight suddenly became something else. Not firelight, explosions, dust, night vision green. A convoy stopped along a narrow Iraqi road. Radio chatter, someone shouting, contact left, contact left." Frank's pulse hammered. His breathing shortened. The walls seemed to close in. Then something warm touched his hand. Duke, the dog, sat directly beside him. Silent, steady, grounded. Frank blinked. The train car returned. The fire returned. The mountains returned. The war faded once more. He exhaled slowly. Easy. The word was meant for both of them. Outside, the wind strengthened. The steel shell groaned again. A long, mournful sound rolled through the darkness. Frank rubbed his face. Sleep would not come easily tonight. Hours passed. The fire shrank. The temperature dropped. The train car seemed alive after midnight. Every gust of wind produced new noises. Steel expanding, steel contracting, loose panels rattling, old bolts vibrating. Each sound arrived unexpectedly. Each sound threatened to drag old memories back into the room. Around 2 in the morning, another noise woke him. Not loud, different. A distant engine. Frank sat upright instantly. Duke lifted his head. The sound drifted through the forest. A vehicle, far away. Maybe hunters, maybe ranchers, maybe nobody important. Still, Frank listened. The engine disappeared after a minute. Yet, sleep never returned. He found himself sitting beside the fire until dawn, watching, listening, waiting, the way he'd spent too many nights years ago. Morning arrived, gray and bitter cold. Snow covered everything outside. The forest looked frozen in place. Frank stepped out carrying a metal cup of coffee. Duke followed. The mountains rose white against the horizon. Beautiful, empty, merciless. For a moment, Frank understood why his father had chosen this place. No distractions, no noise, no expectations. Just survival. The day passed repairing small things. Clearing snow from around the train car. Blocking gaps where wind entered. Gathering deadfall for firewood. Keeping busy helped. Busy hands left less room for ghosts. By evening, dark clouds had begun gathering in the west. Frank noticed them immediately. Years of reading terrain and weather patterns had taught him what to watch. The clouds were wrong. Too low, too thick. Moving too fast. He climbed a small ridge overlooking the valley. Duke stayed close. The wind had shifted, temperature falling, pressure dropping. A storm front was building over the mountains. A big one. Frank stood there for several minutes, watching, calculating, the same way he once studied terrain before entering an AO. The conclusion wasn't complicated. Whatever was coming would arrive soon, and it would arrive hard. He returned to the train car before sunset. Duke followed. The shepherd paused once and looked toward the distant tree line. His ears lifted. Something had caught his attention. Frank followed the dog's gaze. Nothing. Only snow and forest. Still, silent, watching. A strange feeling settled in his stomach. The same feeling he'd learned not to ignore decades ago. The feeling that something was changing. That events already in motion were moving closer. Night fell. The wind strengthened. Snow began drifting sideways across the valley. Frank secured the door as best he could, added more wood to the fire, checked his supplies, then checked them again. Duke lay beside the stove, but he wasn't sleeping. Neither was Frank. Outside, somewhere beyond the mountains, the storm was coming, and by morning, it would be the biggest blizzard this region had seen in years. Frank knew it before the first weather alert ever reached a radio. The mountain had already told him. The wind arrived sometime after midnight, not in gusts, in waves. Each one slammed against the train car hard enough to make the steel walls shudder. Snow hissed across the metal roof. The temperature plunged. Inside, the small stove fought a losing battle. Frank fed another piece of wood into the fire. Duke remained awake beside him. The shepherd's ears twitched at every unfamiliar sound. The train car groaned, like an old ship caught in rough seas. Then came the leak. A single drop landed beside Frank's boot. He glanced up. Another followed, then another. Water seeped through a crack overhead. Within an hour, several leaks had appeared. Tiny streams worked their way down rusted steel ribs. The floor became slick in places. Frank muttered something under his breath. The storm wasn't even at full strength yet. He grabbed an old bucket and shoved it beneath the worst leak. The metal floor rang softly as water dripped into it. Ping, ping, ping. The sound continued for hours. Toward dawn, the storm intensified. The wind screamed through broken seams. Snow forced its way through cracks around the door. Frank pulled his coat tighter. His hands ached from cold. His joints ached from age. For the first time since arriving, doubt settled heavily inside him. Maybe this place wasn't a refuge. Maybe it was a mistake. His father had been gone for nearly 20 years. Dead men couldn't explain maps. Dead men couldn't explain symbols. Dead men couldn't tell you when it was time to walk away. Frank stared into the fire. The flames were shrinking. The woodpile was shrinking faster. Outside, the world had disappeared behind a wall of white. The storm could trap them here for days. Maybe longer. Duke suddenly stood. The dog crossed the train car and stopped near the far corner. Frank barely noticed at first. Then Duke scratched the floor. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed through the darkness. Not now, buddy. Duke scratched again. Harder, Frank watched. The dog lowered his head and pawed at the same exact spot. Again, again, not random, not restless behavior. Focused, intentional. The same way he had searched vehicles during his working years. Frank slowly rose. What do you have? Duke stepped aside. The steel floor looked no different from anywhere else. Rust, dust, age. Yet the dog refused to move away. Frank knelt, ran his glove across the surface. Something caught his attention. A seam, almost invisible. Buried beneath years of grime. His pulse quickened. He fetched a pry bar from the truck supplies. The metal screamed as he forced it into the gap. Nothing moved. He pushed harder. Still nothing. Duke stood beside him the entire time, watching, waiting, almost impatient. Frank adjusted his grip. Then he put his weight into it. The steel suddenly shifted. A sharp metallic crack echoed through the train car. The panel lifted several inches. Cold air rushed upward from below. Frank froze. Beneath the floor was darkness, not empty space, a compartment, hidden, deliberately concealed. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved. The storm hammered outside. The train car shook, but inside everything felt strangely still. Frank raised the flashlight. The beam disappeared into the opening, then found something: wood, paper, metal, a storage compartment, carefully built, carefully hidden. His heartbeat quickened. He widened the opening and aimed the light deeper. Several objects rested inside. A stack of notebooks, rolled maps tied with twine, metal folders sealed against moisture, and a small lockbox. Every item appeared organized, preserved, intentional, as though someone expected them to be found someday. Frank carefully reached down. The first notebook felt dry, despite decades beneath the floor. The cover was worn, no title, no label. He opened it. The flashlight beam illuminated faded handwriting. The first page contained only a name. Frank stopped breathing. For several seconds he simply stared. The letters never changed. They remained exactly where they were. Written in blue ink. Written decades ago. Written by someone who should not have been connected to any of this. Harold Sullivan, his father. The notebook nearly slipped from Frank's hands. Outside, the blizzard roared. Inside, the years collapsed. The railroad worker who had spent his life repairing tracks. The quiet man who rarely spoke about himself. The father who carried secrets into the grave. Frank stared at the name again, then at the hidden compartment, then at the lockbox resting beneath the journals. Nothing about this train car was what he thought it was, and suddenly the strange symbol carved into the steel walls made far more sense. Duke sat beside him, silent, steady, the same way he always did when Frank needed grounding. Frank rested one hand on the dog's neck. The warmth of Duke's fur brought him back to the present. The storm continued outside, but for the first time since arriving at mile 47, Frank no longer wondered whether his father had sent him here intentionally. Now he knew. The only question left was why. And somewhere inside the hidden journals, the maps, and the locked metal box beneath the floor, the answer was waiting. The blizzard raged through the Bitterroot Mountains for 2 straight days. Snow hammered the train car roof. Wind screamed through the pines. The world outside vanished behind an endless curtain of white. For Frank Sullivan, the storm became background noise. The journals had taken its place. He sat beside the stove with one notebook resting across his knees. Duke slept nearby, though one ear always remained alert. The orange glow from the fire flickered across the pages. Harold Sullivan's handwriting was neat, methodical, almost military. That surprised Frank. His father had always seemed like a railroad man, a quiet man, a practical man, not someone who kept detailed records. Yet every page was organized: dates, weather conditions, names, locations, supply inventories, observations. The entries read less like a diary and more like mission reports. Frank turned another page. December 14, 1983, heavy snow. Family of 4 found stranded near Ridge Creek, provided shelter for 3 nights. Child suffering mild hypothermia. Road reopened on 4th day. Family departed safely. The next entry came 2 weeks later. January 10, 1984. Rail worker injured during storm. Compound fracture. Transport impossible. Maintained shelter for 46 hours until rescue reached site. Frank stopped reading. His father had never mentioned any of this. Not once. He flipped forward. Another family, another stranded traveler. A hunter lost during a whiteout. A truck driver trapped after an avalanche closed the pass. Page after page, year after year. Dozens of people, maybe hundreds. The train car had never been abandoned. It had been a refuge. A hidden shelter buried deep in the mountains. And somehow Harold Sullivan had spent decades maintaining it. Frank stared into the fire. A memory surfaced. He was 12 years old. His father loading tools into an old truck before dawn, leaving for several days, returning exhausted, refusing to explain where he had been. Frank always assumed it was railroad work. Now he knew better. The old man had been coming here, helping strangers, saving lives, without ever telling anyone. Duke lifted his head. The dog watched Frank carefully, as if sensing the change happening inside him. Frank reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You knew this place mattered, didn't you?" Duke leaned into the touch. The storm rattled the walls. The train car groaned. Yet the place felt different now. Less like a shelter, more like an inheritance. Later that afternoon, Frank opened one of the rolled maps. The paper crackled with age. Several locations around the mountains had been marked. Supply caches, emergency water sources, safe approaches during winter storms. His father had mapped the region with astonishing detail. Again, it felt less like railroad work, more like field planning, the sort of preparation Frank himself had once done before missions overseas. He found another notebook, this one older, much older. The cover was worn nearly smooth. Inside were entries from the early 1970s. Near the middle, a folded newspaper clipping slipped free. Frank picked it up. The headline caught his attention immediately. "Blizzard traps dozens. In Bitterroot region." The article described a historic storm. Several people had survived after finding emergency shelter somewhere along an abandoned rail line. No location was given. No names were listed. Frank looked down at the train car surrounding him. This train car, his father had been here. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Not sadness, not grief, something deeper, recognition. For the first time in years, Frank felt close to the man he'd never fully understood. Hours passed. Outside, the storm finally began losing strength. The wind softened, the pounding snow eased, the train car settled into silence. Frank turned his attention toward the small metal lockbox. It rested beside him on the floor, unchanged, waiting. He examined it carefully. No damage, no rust. Someone had protected it. The lock itself looked sturdy despite its age. Frank searched the compartment again. Every notebook, every folder, every map. No key, nothing. He sighed and leaned back. Whatever was inside would have to wait. As he gathered the journals, something slipped from between two pages and landed on the floor, a metallic clink. Frank frowned. He picked it up. Not a key, a brass tag. Small, rectangular, stamped with a single word. Depot. He turned it over. Coordinates had been scratched into the back. Very faint. Almost impossible to read. Duke immediately stood. His ears lifted. The dog's attention shifted toward the rear wall of the train car. Not the compartment. Not the lockbox. Something else. Frank followed the dog's gaze. What is it? Duke moved across the train car, slowly, deliberately. His nose lowered toward the floor. He sniffed once, then again, then headed toward the back door. The shepherd stopped there, waiting. Frank looked from the brass tag to the dog, then back again. The coordinates, the word depot, the hidden maps, the strange behavior. A new piece of the puzzle had appeared, and somehow Duke already seemed to know where it pointed. Outside, the storm clouds were finally breaking apart. Sunlight pushed through the mountains for the first time in days. Long golden beams stretched across the snow. The blizzard was over, but the mystery had only deepened, and somewhere beyond the rear wall of the train car, another secret was waiting to be found. The morning after the storm felt almost unreal. 3 days of wind and snow had buried the Bitterroot Mountains beneath a fresh blanket of white. Sunlight poured through the trees, turning the drifts into fields of silver. Frank stood outside the train car with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand. The silence was different now, not empty, peaceful. For the first time since losing his trailer, he wasn't thinking about what had been taken from him. He was thinking about what his father had left behind. Duke stood near the rear of the train car, waiting. The German shepherd had barely moved from that spot all morning. His attention remained fixed on the slope behind the rail car. Frank glanced down at the brass tag again. Depot. The faint coordinates scratched into the back matched the area behind the train car almost exactly. All right, partner. Duke's ears lifted immediately. You've got my attention. The dog started walking. Not running, walking with purpose. Frank grabbed a shovel from the truck and followed. The snow behind the train car reached nearly knee-height in places. Progress was slow. Duke stayed ahead. Every few yards he stopped to make sure Frank was following. The slope behind the rail car rose gradually toward a cluster of old pines. At first, Frank saw nothing unusual. Just snow, trees, rock. Then Duke stopped. The dog lowered his nose, sniffed, turned in a tight circle, then began digging. Snow flew behind him. Frank smiled despite himself. You sure about this? Duke dug harder. Within seconds, his paws hit something solid beneath the snow. Not stone, wood. Frank moved forward. Together they cleared away the drift. A weathered wooden hatch slowly emerged. Frank stared. The hatch blended almost perfectly into the landscape. Without Duke, he would have walked past it 100 times. He brushed away the remaining snow. Iron hinges, heavy construction, old but intact. Someone had built this to last. His pulse quickened again. Another hidden structure, another secret, another piece of whatever mission his father had spent decades protecting. Frank wedged the shovel beneath the edge. The hatch resisted, then suddenly lifted. A rush of cold, stale air escaped from below. Darkness waited beneath. A ladder descended into the earth. Frank aimed his flashlight downward. The beam revealed concrete walls, shelving, crates. An underground storage room. Duke barked once. The sound echoed below. Frank laughed softly. You keep finding things that aren't supposed to exist. Carefully, he climbed down. The room measured roughly 15 feet across, dry, protected, untouched by weather. His flashlight swept across the shelves, and Frank froze. Firewood, stacked floor to ceiling. Not a little, not enough for a few days, enough for months. Nearby stood rows of sealed water containers. Tools hung neatly from pegboards, axes, shovels, hand saws, lanterns, boxes of nails, spare hardware, emergency blankets, everything organized, everything labeled, everything preserved, like a survival cache built by someone expecting people to need it someday. Frank slowly turned in a circle. The scale of it left him speechless. His father hadn't simply maintained a train car. He had built an entire winter refuge, a complete emergency shelter hidden inside the mountains. Duke moved through the room, inspecting every corner. Then he stopped beside a shelf containing canned food. The labels had faded, but most remained intact. Beans, soup, vegetables. Dozens upon dozens of cans. Frank shook his head in disbelief. "Who were you, Dad?" The question disappeared into the silence. No answer came. Only memories. His father loading trucks before dawn. His father returning exhausted after winter storms. His father refusing praise whenever anyone thanked him for helping. Frank finally understood. The old man had never wanted recognition. He wanted readiness. The realization settled deep inside him. For years, Frank had carried guilt. Guilt for surviving friends who hadn't come home. Guilt for mistakes. Guilt for things beyond his control. His father had carried something different. Responsibility. A quiet commitment to people he might never meet. Frank climbed back into the sunlight. The mountain air felt different somehow. Lighter. Duke emerged behind him. The dog's tail wagged once, a small gesture, enough to say mission accomplished. Over the next several days, Frank worked from sunrise until darkness. The hidden supplies changed everything. He repaired holes in the train car walls, reinforced weak sections of the floor, sealed gaps around the doors, built better storage racks, improved the stove. Each evening, the train car grew warmer, stronger, more livable. The place no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive again, like it had been waiting for someone to continue the work. One afternoon, while gathering fallen branches near the edge of the forest, Frank suddenly stopped. Years of reconnaissance work had taught him to notice details. Small details. The ones most people missed. Something wasn't right, he crouched. Studied the snow. A boot print. Fresh. Not his. Not made by any rescue crew. Not old enough to have survived the blizzard. Someone had been here after the storm. Frank followed the trail for several yards. A second print appeared, then a third. Large boots, heavy tread. The same type of track he had noticed days earlier on the mountain road. His jaw tightened. Duke appeared beside him almost instantly. The shepherd's posture changed, alert, focused, watching the trees. Frank slowly scanned the surrounding forest. Nothing moved, no sound, no voice, no vehicle. Only endless pines, yet the feeling remained. The unmistakable sensation of being observed. He had trusted that feeling overseas. It had saved lives. Now it returned. Frank stared into the shadows between the trees. Whoever had been here was gone, but not long ago, and something told him they would be back. Frank didn't mention the footprints to anyone. There was no one to tell. Still, the discovery stayed with him. That night, after feeding the stove and checking the reinforced door, he walked the perimeter of the train car one final time. Old habits. Observe, check, confirm. The forest stood silent beneath a sky crowded with stars. Duke moved beside him without a leash. Without commands, the dog knew the routine. Every few steps, Duke stopped and tested the wind. Listening, smelling, reading the darkness in ways no human could. Satisfied, they returned inside. The train car felt different now. Warmer. The repaired walls blocked most of the drafts. The stove burned steadily. For the first time in months, Frank slept more than 3 hours. Not perfectly, but enough, until the knocking started. 3 sharp bangs echoed against the steel door. Frank's eyes opened instantly. His body reacted before his mind. 1 second asleep, the next fully awake, breathing controlled, listening. Duke was already standing. The shepherd faced the entrance, ears forward, silent. Another knock, not aggressive, desperate. Frank checked his watch. Just after dawn. Nobody should have been out here. He grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the door. The moment he opened it, freezing air rushed inside. A young man stood outside, late 20s, maybe early 30s. Unshaven, thin, wearing a worn military field jacket. Snow clung to his shoulders, his hands shook from cold. Behind him sat an old pickup truck half buried in a drift, one tire completely collapsed. The man looked exhausted, not physically, something deeper. The kind Frank recognized immediately. The kind he saw in mirrors. "Sorry," the man said quietly. "My truck died." Frank studied him, the eyes gave it away. Always the eyes, too alert, too tired, watching everything. The same way veterans watched rooms long after they came home. "How long have you been out there?" "Since yesterday." Frank stepped aside. "Get inside." The young man hesitated, then entered. The warmth hit him immediately. His shoulders dropped a fraction. Not much, just enough. Duke approached carefully. The man froze, not afraid, evaluating. Then Duke sniffed his hand once and walked away. Approval granted. That seemed to relax everyone. The man's name was Mason Reed, former Army infantry, Afghanistan. 2 deployments, 3 years homeless. Frank never asked for details. He didn't need them. Some stories announced themselves. Others stayed buried. The stove crackled. Coffee brewed. Snow fell softly outside. For several hours they spoke very little. Neither seemed bothered by the silence. Men like them understood silence. That evening Mason noticed the journals. "Your father's?" Frank nodded. Mason ran a hand across one cover. "Looks like he planned ahead." "He did. You don't see much of that anymore." Frank glanced toward the hidden compartment beneath the floor. His father had planned for storms, for strangers, for people with nowhere else to go. Maybe even for this exact moment. 2 veterans sitting beside a stove in a forgotten train car. The thought lingered. 3 days later, Mason was still there, helping repair walls, cutting firewood, fixing broken shelves, never asking permission, never acting entitled, simply useful. Frank appreciated that. Then another visitor arrived. The second one surprised him even more. It happened during a heavy snowfall. Duke heard her before anyone else. The dog suddenly stood from beside the stove, crossed the train car, stopped at the door, tail wagging slowly, not alarmed, curious. Frank opened the door. An older woman stood outside, wrapped in layers of worn winter clothing. Her pickup truck waited behind her, loaded with everything she owned. The woman introduced herself as Evelyn Parker, a widow. Her small ranch had failed after years of drought and debt. The bank had taken the rest. Frank found the irony difficult to ignore. The mountain seemed to be collecting people lately. Evelyn laughed when she saw the train car. "Well," she said, brushing snow from her coat, "I've certainly lived in worse places." The sound startled Frank, not because it was loud, because it was genuine. The first real laugh he'd heard in months. Within days, Evelyn transformed parts of the shelter, organized supplies, cleaned storage areas, improvised curtains, cooked meals that actually tasted like food. The train car slowly stopped feeling like a survival site. It began feeling like a community. A small one, fragile but real. One evening the 3 sat around the stove while snow drifted outside. For the first time in years, Frank found himself listening more than remembering. The nightmare still came. Sometimes a metallic groan from the train car dragged him halfway back to Iraq. Sometimes a flash of distant headlights made his pulse spike. But now there were voices afterward, coffee afterward, people afterward, and Duke. Always Duke. Then came the discovery, the one that changed everything. Frank was checking the outer perimeter near sunset. Duke suddenly stiffened. The dog's ears locked forward. His body became motionless. Frank followed his gaze. A figure stood on a distant ridge, watching too far away to identify, too still to be accidental. The person remained there for only seconds, then disappeared behind the trees. Gone. Frank climbed the ridge immediately. Years of training pushed him forward, fast, quiet, observing. But when he arrived, the watcher had vanished. Only tracks remained, boot prints, fresh, deliberate, and beside one print lay something else. A business card. Frank picked it up. The name printed across the front meant nothing at first. Randall Briggs, land acquisition consultant. Frank stared at the card, then at the tracks leading deeper into the forest. Something cold settled in his stomach. The man wasn't lost, he wasn't hunting, and he wasn't here by accident. Whoever Randall Briggs was, he had been watching the train car, watching Frank, and watching everything his father had hidden in these mountains. Frank slipped the business card into his jacket pocket and headed back toward the train car. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the western ridge. Long shadows stretched through the snow-covered forest. The temperature was already falling. Duke stayed close. The German shepherd glanced behind them more than once during the walk home. Frank noticed. He always noticed. The same way he'd once noticed changes in silence before an ambush. The same way Duke noticed things long before people did. Back at the train car, Mason studied the card. Land acquisition? Evelyn frowned. Nobody buys land this far back unless they're after something. Frank looked toward the dark windows. Maybe. Or maybe the man already knew something about the train car. Something hidden. Something valuable. That possibility stayed with him long after the others went to sleep. That night, the old dreams returned. Not because of the train car. Not because of Randall Briggs. Because of the silence. Silence had always been dangerous. Frank found himself standing once again beneath a foreign sky. Dust, heat, the smell of diesel fuel. A convoy stalled along a narrow Iraqi road. The radio crackled. Someone shouted coordinates. Then came the explosion. Frank woke instantly. His pulse raced. The stove glowed faintly across the room. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was. Duke appeared beside him. The shepherd pressed against his knee, grounding him, anchoring him. The nightmare faded. The mountains returned. The train car returned. The war stayed where it belonged, far away. Morning arrived clear and cold. Frank decided to patrol the surrounding area. Not because he expected trouble, because uncertainty bothered him more than facts. Duke trotted beside him. The forest felt peaceful. Fresh snow sparkled beneath the sun. Birdsong drifted through the trees. Nothing moved except the wind. A mile from the train car, Frank stopped near a rocky ridge. He crouched, studied a patch of snow. Tracks, not human, large, round, fresh. His expression tightened. Mountain lion. Duke immediately caught the scent. The dog's posture changed. Tail lowered, ears forward, focused. Frank rose slowly. The tracks were recent, very recent. He glanced toward the tree line. Nothing. The forest appeared empty, still, watching. The old instinct returned. The feeling that eyes were hidden somewhere beyond sight. Let's head back. Duke obeyed immediately. The two began moving toward the train car. Halfway there, Duke suddenly froze, every muscle locked. A low growl rolled from deep inside his chest. Frank turned. Nothing. Then he heard it. A sound, not loud. A branch snapping somewhere behind them. The forest fell silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Years of survival training screamed the same warning. Something was wrong. Frank slowly backed toward a cluster of rocks. Better cover. Better visibility. Duke positioned himself between Frank and the trees. The shepherd's growl deepened. Then the attack came. A blur exploded from the pines, fast, almost invisible. The mountain lion launched itself directly toward Frank. Duke moved before Frank could. The German shepherd slammed into the animal mid-air. The impact sent both creatures crashing into the snow. Frank stumbled backward. The world became movement. Teeth, fur, snow, growls. The lion recovered first. Its claws flashed. Duke lunged again, buying precious seconds. Frank grabbed the emergency flare launcher attached to his pack. The lion twisted. Its attention shifted toward him. Too close, far too close. Duke intercepted again. The shepherd crashed into the predator's shoulder. Both disappeared into a spray of snow. Then Frank saw it. Red, blood, against white snow. His stomach dropped. Duke! The lion wheeled around. A deep gash marked Duke's shoulder. Still the dog stood his ground. Still he refused to retreat. Frank fired the flare. The bright projectile screamed through the air. A burst of red light exploded beside the lion. The animal recoiled instantly, startled, confused. Frank fired a second flare. The predator hesitated, then disappeared into the forest, gone, just like that. Silence returned, the kind of silence that followed violence. Frank dropped to his knees beside Duke. The shepherd remained standing, barely. Blood stained the fur around his shoulder. The wound wasn't catastrophic, but it was serious, far too serious. Frank's hands trembled as he examined it, not from fear, from memory. He had knelt beside wounded friends before, too many times. Duke nudged his hand, the same way he always did, as if reminding Frank to focus, to stay present, to keep moving. You're okay. The words sounded unconvincing even to him. Duke's tail moved once, just once. Frank immediately began first aid, pressure, bandaging, assessment. The old routines returned automatically. Training layered over emotion. By the time they reached the train car, Evelyn and Mason were waiting outside. One look at Duke and both rushed forward. The next several hours passed in a blur. Bandages, warm blankets, careful monitoring. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but recovery would take time. That night nobody slept much. Frank sat beside Duke's bed near the stove, watching every breath, every movement, every small sign. Outside, snow drifted quietly through the mountains. Inside, the train car felt smaller than ever. The thought kept returning 1 second, 1 second later, and he might have lost the dog, the only companion who had walked beside him through every loss, every eviction, every sleepless night, every mile to mile 47. Near midnight, Duke finally lifted his head. His eyes met Frank's. The shepherd looked exhausted, but alive. Frank exhaled slowly. Only then did he realize how tightly he'd been holding himself together. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and beside the stove, Frank sat with one hand resting on Duke's bandaged shoulder. For the first time since arriving at mile 47, he understood something his father's journals had never directly said. A refuge wasn't built from steel, or wood, or supplies. It was built from whoever stayed beside you when everything else tried to take them away. The days following Duke's injury moved more slowly than any storm. The train car remained quiet. Not because there was nothing to do, because everyone found themselves listening, watching, waiting, watching Duke breathe, watching him stand, watching him heal. The German shepherd spent most of his time beside the stove. His shoulder remained heavily bandaged. The wound closed little by little, but every movement reminded Frank how close they had come to losing him. Duke hated resting. That became obvious immediately. Twice Frank caught him trying to follow Mason outside. 3 times he found the dog standing guard near the door instead of sleeping. Each time Frank pointed back toward the stove, Duke would stare at him, then reluctantly obey. The exchange became their daily routine. The first real snowfall after the attack arrived quietly. Large flakes drifted through the pines. The mountains disappeared behind white curtains. Inside the train car, Evelyn simmered soup over the stove. Mason repaired a broken shelf. For the first time in years, Frank realized he wasn't alone with his memories. The realization felt unfamiliar, comforting and uncomfortable at the same time. Late one evening, after the others had gone to sleep, Frank returned to the hidden compartment beneath the floor. The journals sat exactly where he'd left them. The lockbox rested beside them, still unopened, still waiting. He wasn't entirely sure why he kept avoiding it. Maybe because questions were easier than answers. The fire crackled softly. Duke lifted his head from across the room. Watching, always watching. Frank picked up the brass key, the one discovered weeks earlier inside his father's records. He had searched every inch of the train car, every shelf, every crate, every wall. Nothing. Then earlier that afternoon, while repairing a loose panel beneath an old storage bench, his hand had brushed against something hidden, a keyhole, small, almost invisible beneath layers of rust. Now the lockbox sat in his lap. The key fit perfectly. For a moment he hesitated, the same feeling he'd experienced before opening the journals. A strange awareness that once opened, things could never return to mystery. Then he turned the key, the lock clicked, soft, final. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Frank slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay only a few items. A folded military photograph, an old service ribbon, and a sealed envelope. Nothing more. No treasure, no cash, no deed to hidden land, just an envelope. The handwriting on the front made his chest tighten. Frank, his father's handwriting, his name. The envelope had never been opened, not once. For several seconds he simply stared, then carefully unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly. The words were faded, but readable, very readable. Frank began to read. The train car seemed to disappear around him. The mountains disappeared. The fire disappeared. Only the words remained. His father wrote about winter, about responsibility, about mistakes, about silence. Then came the line that stopped Frank completely. I know what war can leave behind. Frank lowered the page. Confusion crossed his face. His father had never spoken about military service. Never, not once. Slowly he continued reading. The letter revealed pieces of a life Frank never knew existed. Before becoming a railroad worker, Harold Sullivan had served in the army during Vietnam. Not combat infantry, transportation and logistics, but long enough, close enough, long enough to understand sleepless nights, long enough to understand what memories could do to a man, long enough to understand why some wounds never appeared on skin. Frank's hands tightened around the letter. The fire popped softly. Duke remained motionless beside the stove. The old man continued reading. The words became more personal. Harold admitted he had seen changes in his son after Iraq. The silence, the distance, the restless nights, the way Frank always sat facing doors, the way loud noises pulled his eyes toward exits, the way he scanned crowds without realizing it. Harold had noticed everything, yet never knew how to begin the conversation. Instead, he built. He built the train car. He built the hidden storage room. He built emergency routes, supply caches, places for people with nowhere else to go. And then came the final revelation. Frank read the paragraph twice, then a third time. The train car had never been meant for strangers alone. It had been meant for him. Years earlier, Harold had begun preparing Mile 47 specifically for the possibility that his son might one day need it. Not because he expected failure, because life was unpredictable, because war followed people home, because sometimes strong men lost everything, and because fathers worried long after their children became old themselves. Frank stared into the fire. The words blurred slightly. He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, read the paragraph again. His father had known. Not every detail, not every struggle, but enough. Enough to leave a path. Enough to leave a refuge. Enough to leave hope hidden beneath a steel floor in the mountains. A sound broke the silence. Duke, the dog, had crossed the room, slowly, carefully, his injured shoulder still stiff. The shepherd lowered himself beside Frank, then rested his head across the old man's knee. Frank placed one hand on Duke's neck. The familiar warmth grounded him. Outside, snow drifted softly through the darkness. Inside, the fire burned low. For a long time, Frank sat there without moving, the letter resting in his lap, the dog beside him, the train car around him, everything suddenly making sense. His father hadn't left him a building. He hadn't left him supplies. He hadn't left him a secret. He had left him a future. And for the first time since losing his home, Frank no longer felt like he had been abandoned by the world. Because decades before the bank took his trailer, decades before the mountains called him here, someone had already been preparing a place for him to land. The letter stayed folded inside Frank's jacket pocket for the next several days. Not because he was finished reading it, because he wasn't. Every time he opened it, another sentence seemed to mean something different. Another piece of his father emerged from between the lines. Outside, winter tightened its grip on the bitter roots. The sky grew heavier, the air sharper. The old mountain instincts Frank trusted began whispering the same warning. Something bigger was coming. 3 days later, the warning became reality. The first alert arrived over a crackling weather radio Mason had repaired from spare parts. Historic winter system. Blizzard conditions. Travel strongly discouraged. The signal faded beneath static. Frank didn't need the rest. He had already seen the clouds building over the western ridges. By afternoon, the mountains disappeared. By sunset, the wind arrived. By midnight, the world vanished. The storm hit harder than anything they had experienced so far. Snow moved sideways. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The train car shook beneath the force of the wind. Trees groaned outside. Branches snapped. Somewhere in the darkness, an entire pine crashed to the ground with a thunderous crack. Inside, everyone worked. No panic, no wasted movement. Frank slipped into a familiar rhythm, the same calm focus that had once carried him through dangerous situations overseas. Only now the mission was different. Protect the shelter, protect the people. He assigned sleeping areas, checked water supplies, counted blankets, monitored firewood usage, rotated watch shifts. Mason handled repairs. Evelyn organized food and medical supplies. Nobody argued. Everyone understood. The storm wasn't their enemy. Carelessness was. By dawn, the radio reported widespread power outages. Then the signal disappeared entirely. The outside world went silent. Late that morning, Duke suddenly stood. The German Shepherd's shoulder had improved considerably. Though he still favored the injured leg, he moved toward the door, stopped, listened. Frank noticed immediately. "What is it, buddy?" Duke let out a low sound, not a bark, a warning. Then came the noise, a distant pounding against metal, faint, almost impossible to hear beneath the storm. Everyone froze. There it was again. Someone outside. Frank opened the door only a few inches. Wind exploded inward. Snow swirled through the gap. Shapes emerged from the white. 3 people, 2 adults and a teenage boy, exhausted, half frozen. Their truck had slid off a mountain road several miles away. They had been walking for hours. Frank didn't hesitate. Get inside. The family stumbled into the warmth. Within minutes, Evelyn had blankets wrapped around them. Hot soup warming their hands. The train car suddenly felt smaller, and that was only the beginning. Throughout the day, more people arrived. A hunter stranded during the storm. An elderly couple trapped when their generator failed. 2 snowmobilers who lost their route markers. The hidden shelter Harold Sullivan had built decades ago was doing exactly what it had always done, saving people. By nightfall, nearly 20 people occupied the train car. The old steel walls echoed with quiet conversations. Children slept beneath borrowed blankets. Coffee simmered on the stove. Snow hammered endlessly outside. Frank stood near the doorway, watching, listening, the same way he once watched temporary bases during deployments. Only this time there were no weapons, no enemies, just responsibility. A sudden movement caught his eye. Duke. The dog had moved to the door again, alert, focused. Frank frowned. The shepherd's instincts had already proven themselves more than once. He opened the door. Nothing. Only darkness and blowing snow. Then Duke pushed forward, ignoring his healing shoulder. The dog stepped into the blizzard. Duke! The shepherd kept going. 10 yards. 20. 30. Frank grabbed a flashlight and followed. The storm immediately swallowed them. Visibility shrank to only a few feet. The wind roared. Snow stung his face. Duke continued moving, nose low, tracking something. Then Frank saw it, a small shape partially buried beside a fallen tree. For one terrifying second, he thought it was a drift. Then it moved. A child, a little girl, maybe 8 years old, curled beneath the snow, barely conscious. Frank's heart dropped. Duke had found her. The shepherd stood over the girl, refusing to leave her side. Frank wrapped her in his coat, lifted her carefully, then looked down at Duke. The dog was trembling from exhaustion. Snow covered his fur. The injured shoulder had started bleeding again, yet he remained standing, still guarding, still working. Even now, back at the train car, the arrival of the child changed everything. The shelter grew quieter, more focused. People stopped thinking only about themselves. They helped, shared, watched over one another. By morning, the girl was awake, alive. Her parents arrived hours later after search crews finally located the disabled vehicle. The reunion brought tears to more than one set of eyes. Frank quietly stepped outside before anyone noticed his own reaction. Snow continued falling, but something had changed. The train car was no longer simply a refuge. It had become the center of survival for everyone trapped in the mountains. The place once mocked as the Iron Coffin had become the only safe haven for miles. Frank looked across the storm-covered valley. Lights flickered in distant rescue vehicles struggling through the whiteout. The blizzard still raged. The worst might not even be over. Yet inside the train car, dozens of people were alive, because one forgotten railroad worker had planned ahead, and because one stubborn German shepherd had refused to stop looking for those who needed help. Frank glanced toward the doorway. Duke rested near the stove, exhausted, injured, surrounded by grateful strangers. For the first time since arriving at mile 47, Frank understood exactly what his father had been building all those years. Not a shelter, a lifeline. And before this storm was over, the entire region was about to learn the same lesson. The blizzard finally began to weaken on the 4th day. Not all at once. The wind eased first. Then the snowfall thinned. By the 5th morning, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in nearly a week. People stepped outside carefully. The landscape looked transformed. Entire sections of forest had vanished beneath drifts. Roads were impossible to recognize. Vehicles sat buried under mountains of snow. The world seemed frozen in place, yet the train car stood, scarred, weathered, still standing. Inside, the atmosphere felt different. The strangers who had arrived frightened and exhausted were no longer strangers. People shared food without being asked. They split firewood. They checked on one another. The little girl Duke had found spent most of her time sitting beside him. The German shepherd accepted the attention with quiet dignity. His shoulder was healing, though a visible limp remained. Whenever someone thanked Frank for saving them, he always pointed toward Duke. Thank him. And every time, Duke simply wagged his tail. 3 days later, rescue crews finally reached the valley. Snowplows reopened sections of road. Families returned home. The train car slowly emptied. Goodbyes echoed through the steel walls. Handshakes, hugs, promises to come back and visit. For the first time in many years, Frank watched people leave without feeling abandoned. The place remained. The fire remained. Duke remained. That was enough. Then the reporters arrived. A local newspaper from Hamilton. A television crew from Missoula. Word had spread quickly. A forgotten train car hidden in the mountains had sheltered more than 24 people during the worst blizzard in decades. The story sounded unbelievable, which made people want to hear it even more. Frank hated attention, always had, but the reporters kept showing up. Soon photographs appeared online, then interviews, then stories about Harold Sullivan and the journals. The old railroad worker who had quietly saved lives for decades. People loved stories like that, especially when they were true. A week later, trouble arrived. This time it came in a black SUV. The vehicle rolled slowly up the newly cleared access road. Frank noticed it immediately. So did Duke. The shepherd stood, his ears lifted. The scar on his shoulder caught the sunlight as he moved toward the door. Frank stepped outside. The SUV stopped 20 yards away. The driver emerged, mid-50s, expensive coat, polished boots, confident smile. Frank recognized him instantly. Randall Briggs, the name from the business card. The man who had been watching them. Randall approached, as though he already belonged there. "Mr. Sullivan." Frank said nothing. Randall looked around. The train car, the repaired shelter, the surrounding land. His smile widened. Quite a place. "What do you want?" Randall's expression barely changed. "I came regarding ownership." The word hung in the air. Frank felt Mason step outside behind him. Evelyn appeared moments later. Duke remained at Frank's side. Watching, Randall opened a folder. "I recently acquired property rights covering this section of land." He pointed toward the train car. "This structure falls within those boundaries." Frank took the documents. "Read them, then read them again." The language was complicated, legal, deliberately so. But the message was simple. Randall intended to take control of everything. The train car, the surrounding land, the shelter, all of it. "You waited until after the storm." Randall shrugged. "I didn't think anyone would survive out here." The honesty of the statement chilled Frank more than the winter air. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mason laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the situation was absurd. People had nearly died. Others had been saved. And now someone wanted paperwork. Randall ignored him. "This can be handled professionally." Frank handed the documents back. "We're not going anywhere." The smile disappeared. For the first time, Randall looked annoyed. "You don't understand." "No," Frank replied calmly. "I understand perfectly." The confrontation ended without resolution. Randall returned to his SUV and drove away, but not before delivering one final warning. "This isn't over." The vehicle disappeared down the mountain road. Silence followed. Evelyn looked worried. Mason looked angry. Frank looked toward the train car, toward the place his father had built, toward the place that had saved lives. Then he looked at Duke. The shepherd's gaze remained fixed on the road long after the SUV vanished, as if he understood exactly what kind of threat had just arrived. The next week became a battle of paperwork. Reporters continued visiting. Local residents who had sheltered during the blizzard began speaking publicly. Then something unexpected happened. One of the journalists asked to see Harold Sullivan's journals. Frank agreed. The reporter spent 2 days reading every page, every rescue, every winter, every life saved. The resulting article spread across Montana. Soon historians became interested, then county officials, then attorneys, and eventually, someone discovered buried deeper than the snow. Records, old records, documents connected to the railroad. The same railroad Harold had worked for decades earlier. One afternoon, a county representative arrived carrying a thick folder. The meeting lasted less than an hour. When it ended, Randall Briggs' entire claim collapsed. The land surrounding the train car had never legally transferred into private ownership. Decades earlier, the railroad company had quietly donated the property into a community preservation trust. The records had simply been forgotten. Until now, Randall's documents meant nothing. His acquisition meant nothing. His plans vanished in a single afternoon. News traveled fast. By sunset, the entire valley knew. By the following morning, Randall Briggs was gone. This time for good. That evening, people began arriving again. Not because they needed shelter, because they wanted to help. Volunteers repaired fences. Others cleared debris. Some brought supplies. Others brought stories. The train car glowed warmly beneath the setting sun. Children laughed outside. Neighbors shared coffee. The mountains stood silent around them. For years, the place had been hidden, forgotten, ignored. Now it belonged exactly where Harold Sullivan always intended, to the people who needed it. And as Frank watched the gathering from the doorway, one thought settled quietly in his mind. The hardest battles weren't always fought in war. Sometimes they were fought to protect a place worth coming home to. Winter finally loosened its grip sometime in late March. The change arrived gradually. A drip of melting snow from the train car roof, a patch of brown earth appearing beside the tracks, the distant sound of running water somewhere beneath the ice. Then one morning Frank stepped outside and realized the mountains looked different. The bitter roots were still covered in snow near their peaks, but lower down, green was returning. Spring had begun. The train car stood exactly where it always had, rusty, weathered, scarred by decades of storms, yet somehow stronger than ever. Around it, life had taken root. Volunteers returned every weekend. Some repaired fences, others cleared fallen timber. A retired carpenter from Hamilton built new storage shelves. A local church donated blankets and emergency supplies. Even the county contributed materials after the blizzard story spread across Montana. Nobody called it the Iron Coffin anymore. The old nickname disappeared naturally. People had found a better name. Sullivan Crossing. Frank hated it. The name made him uncomfortable. But nobody listened. The sign appeared anyway, hand-painted, mounted beside the rail line, and somehow it stayed. One afternoon Mason stood beside it and grinned. "Looks official." Frank shook his head. "It looks expensive." Mason laughed. The sound echoed through the valley. Months earlier, neither of them had laughed much. Now it happened often. That alone felt like a victory. Duke lay nearby beneath the afternoon sun. The German shepherd had recovered remarkably well. The scar remained visible beneath his fur, a permanent reminder of the mountain lion attack. His limp never completely disappeared. Some days it was barely noticeable. Other days it returned after long walks. Frank worried about it far more than Duke did. The dog simply adapted, the way good soldiers always had. The little girl Duke, rescued during the storm, visited several times that spring. Every visit followed the same pattern. She ran straight toward him. Duke accepted the attention patiently, then escorted her around the property as though conducting inspections. Everyone found it amusing. Frank secretly enjoyed it more than anyone. One evening he sat outside alone watching the sunset. The sky burned orange above the mountains. The rail line disappeared into the horizon. Duke rested beside his chair. The old letter lay folded in Frank's hands. The paper had grown soft from repeated reading. He knew every sentence by heart. Yet he still opened it, still read it, still searched it for pieces of his father, the man he thought he knew, and the man he had only recently discovered. Footsteps approached behind him. Evelyn. She handed him a cup of coffee, then sat quietly beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. The valley didn't require conversation. Eventually she nodded toward the letter. "You've read that thing 100 times." Frank smiled. "At least, you ever find what you're looking for?" He thought about the question, then looked across the property. People moved between buildings. Volunteers worked near the storage shed. Mason helped repair a fence. Children laughed somewhere near the creek. Duke slept peacefully beside his boots. For years, Frank had searched for stability, for purpose, for somewhere that felt permanent. He lost homes, lost friends, lost parts of himself he never expected to lose. Then life had stripped away almost everything, until one map remained, one train car, one old dog, one final chance. "I think so," he said. Good." The sun slipped lower. Shadows stretched across the valley. For the first time in decades, Frank realized something surprising. The nights had changed. The metal sounds from the train car still happened. Steel expanded. Steel contracted. The familiar groans remained, yet they no longer dragged him back to Iraq. The flashing headlights of distant vehicles no longer sent his pulse racing. He still remembered, always would, but the memories no longer controlled the room, or the night, or him. Healing hadn't arrived all at once. It never did. It came through routine, through purpose, through people, and through a German shepherd who refused to leave his side. Later that evening, Frank stepped inside the train car. The walls glowed warmly beneath lantern light. The stove crackled. Photographs from the winter now decorated one section of the wall. Families, rescue crews, volunteers, moments frozen in time. Near the center hung Harold Sullivan's letter, protected behind glass, visible to everyone who entered. Frank stopped before it one final time. His eyes moved to the last paragraph, the one he always returned to, the one that mattered most. Con always thought I was leaving you a train car. The truth is, I was leaving you the people who would find it after you. Frank stood there for a long moment, then looked around, at the shelter, at the photographs, at the life growing inside these steel walls. His father had been right. The train car was never the gift. The people were. A soft sound made him turn. Duke had entered behind him. The old shepherd crossed the room slowly, then lowered himself beside the stove, exactly where he always chose to sleep. Frank smiled. Outside, the final light of day settled across the Montana mountains. Inside, the fire burned steadily. Warm, steady, certain. Duke rested his head across Frank's worn boots. The same boots that had crossed deserts. The same boots that had crossed mountains. The same boots that had carried him all the way to mile 47. Frank reached down and rested a hand on the dog's neck. Neither moved, neither needed to. Beyond the windows, the abandoned rail line faded into the golden horizon. Ahead lay more winters, more storms, more people who would someday need help. But for now, there was only peace. Frank Sullivan had come to the mountains believing he had lost everything. Instead, he found what had been waiting for him all along. Not a treasure, not a secret, not even a train car. A place to belong, and this time, it stayed. Before you go, I'd love to hear your answer. If you believe Frank made the right choice by staying and building something bigger than himself, leave a simple 1 in the comments. If you think you would have sold everything and started over somewhere else, leave a 0. No long explanation needed, just a 1 or a 0. And if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. There are more unforgettable stories ahead. Stories about loyalty, second chances, resilience, and the extraordinary bond between veterans and the dogs who never stop standing beside them. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next story.